All right, let's get right into one of history's most compelling visual mysteries. We're heading deep inside an ancient Egyptian temple, and we're going to look at a carving that's over 2,000 years old. A carving that has kicked off an absolutely incredible debate. And why all the fuss? Well, because to a whole lot of people, it looks, for all the world, like a modern light bulb.
And that right there, that's the heart of the whole mystery. You've got two completely different camps. On one side, you've got electrical engineers and other researchers who look at this thing and see hard evidence of some kind of lost, advanced technology. But on the other side, you've got mainstream Egyptologists, and they see a beautiful, really complex religious symbol. Here's the thing, though. Both sides claim to have solid evidence. So today, we're going to lay it all out and take a look at both arguments.
But before we zoom in on the carving itself, let's just kind of set the scene a little. I want you to imagine you're back in ancient Egypt, right around the time of the famous Cleopatra. You've made a journey to the Dendera Temple, and this place is just buzzing with spiritual energy. See, this wasn't just any old temple. It was a huge center for the worship of Hathor, the goddess of love, beauty, and maybe most importantly, healing. People literally came from all over the known world, hoping for some kind of miraculous cure. So you have to remember, this carving isn't just a random decoration. It's in a place with some serious spiritual weight. Okay, so here's our game plan for digging into this. First up, we're going to explore the temple itself. Then, we'll get a real close look at the carvings that are causing all the debate. After that, we're going to give both theories a totally fair hearing. We're talking ancient electricity versus sacred symbolism. And to wrap it all up, we'll hit you with the three biggest questions that honestly, neither side has a perfect answer for.
All right, let's start with where this all takes place. The absolutely magnificent Temple of Hathor at Dendera.
I mean, just look at this place. It's stunning. And honestly, the only reason we can even have this debate today is because the Dendera complex is so incredibly well preserved. It's one of the best in all of Egypt. And that preservation means we can see the art, the carvings, the inscriptions in unbelievable detail. It's like they've been holding onto their secrets for millennia, just waiting for us.
So, get this. These carvings were made around 50 BCE. This was a really fascinating time in history when Greek rulers, the Ptolemies, were in charge, but they had totally embraced Egyptian culture. Later on, even the Romans came in and added their own touches to the temple. But the real mystery, the thing we're here to talk about, well, that lies hidden deep beneath the main floor, down in these dark underground crypts.
Okay, so let's head down into those crypts. We're going to look at the evidence with our own eyes, before we get into what anyone thinks it means. For now, we're just going to describe exactly what's carved right there in the stone.
And here it is. This is the one. The famous Dendera light relief. You find it tucked away in this long, narrow underground hallway, and, right off the bat, you can see why it's so captivating, why it's so weird. It just doesn't really look like your typical ancient Egyptian art, does it? So let's really zoom in here and break down the details. You've got these big pear-shaped objects. They really do look like giant bulbs. And inside each one, you can clearly see a long, wavy serpent carved into the stone. And take a look at the human figures. See how they're holding them up or kind of tending to them? Okay, this line drawing really helps break it down to the bare essentials. So notice how the bulb seems to be emerging from a lotus flower at its base. Then the whole thing is propped up by this very specific object. That's called a jed pillar. And here's a crucial part. You see that line? It looks just like a cable, and it runs from the lotus flower over to what appears to be a small rectangular box. So let's keep those four key elements in mind. You've got the bulb, the serpent, the pillar, and the cable.
All right, now that we've seen exactly what we're dealing with, let's dive into our first theory. And it's a provocative one. The idea that what we're actually looking at is some kind of schematic, a blueprint for an ancient electrical device. So, the argument really gets going when you compare the carving to something called the Crookes tube. Now, a Crookes tube was basically an early experimental kind of light bulb from the 1800s. And when you put them side by side, wow, it really gets to the heart of the argument. You have the sealed glass bulb, the snake-like plasma discharge you see inside it, the need for a high-voltage insulator, which looks a lot like that dead pillar, and, of course, a power source, which could be that box. The visual parallels are, well, they're pretty hard to ignore.
So it all comes down to how perfectly these elements seem to map onto modern electrical components. The bulb is the glass tube. The serpent is the electrical arc, the plasma filament. The jed pillar acts as an insulator, and the cable and box, well, that's your power supply. And supporters of this theory bring up a huge piece of circumstantial evidence, the mystery of the clean ceilings. They argue that deep inside these tombs and crypts, there's no soot,
Torches or oil lamps would have left the ceilings black, right? But a clean electric light, that would be totally smokeless. But that raises a big question. Where would the electricity even come from? Well, proponents of this theory point to this thing, the Baghdad Battery. It was discovered in modern-day Iraq, and it dates to roughly the same time period. And what is it? It's a simple clay pot with a copper tube and an iron rod inside. You know what that sounds like? It sounds like all the basic parts of a simple battery, a galvanic cell.
And this isn't just a wild guess. People have built modern versions of these things. And when you fill them with something acidic like vinegar or even grape juice, a single one of these jars can actually produce up to 1.4 volts. Now, look, that's not enough to power a light bulb by itself, but what it does do is prove that the basic principle of creating electricity was potentially known way back then. And if you string enough of them together, well then, you could start to generate a pretty significant charge.
Okay, so the ancient tech argument is definitely compelling. There's some pretty intriguing evidence there. But what if we've been looking at this completely the wrong way? Let's switch gears and turn to the mainstream explanation, the one you'll get from pretty much any Egyptologist. And trust me, it paints a completely different but honestly an equally fascinating picture.
See, for Egyptologists, this isn't a machine at all. It's a story. It's a creation myth, told in pictures. They argue that every single element we've looked at already has a well-known, deeply symbolic meaning in ancient Egyptian religion. That bulb? It's not bulb. It's the sacred lotus flower, which is a massive symbol of creation and rebirth. The serpent inside? That's the god Harsamtis, a creator god himself. The jed pillar, the so-called insulator? That's one of the most powerful symbols in Egypt, the backbone of the god Osiris, representing stability. And that cable? That's a symbolic umbilical cord, representing a divine birth.
But hold on, what about that whole no-soot argument? It sounds pretty convincing, right? Well, according to researchers who have actually been to these sites and examined them, they say it's just not true. This quote here explains it pretty well. Not only is there soot in many of these ancient passages, but there's even soot on the walls of the very same crypts where these carvings were found. The bottom line is, the soot is there if you know where to look. So if it wasn't electric lights, how did they see in these pitch-black places? Well, mainstream archaeology has some really well-documented answers. For starters, they use simple olive oil lamps. And if you trim the wick just right, they burn incredibly cleanly, with almost no smoke. We also have actual ancient records, papyri that are basically timesheets, documenting the daily rations of wicks and oil that were handed out to workers in the tombs. And finally, they were absolute masters of using reflected light, with highly polished bronze mirrors to bounce sunlight from the entrance deep, deep into the darkness.
So there you have it. Two very different and honestly, two very compelling explanations for the same carving. But the debate is far from over, because there are still a few key questions hanging out there that neither side has a really great answer for.
So here's the big challenge for the purely symbolic theory. If this is just another creation myth, why does it look so technical? Why is it depicted in this really strange, almost schematic way? Out of the thousands of other mythological scenes in Egyptian art, why does this one look so much like a technical diagram?
And on the flip side, here's the absolute biggest problem for the ancient electricity theory. If they really had light bulbs, where's the rest of this stuff? I mean, where are the fragments of glass bulbs? Where are the filaments, the wires, the power sources? We've had more than a century of the most intense archaeology imaginable in Egypt, and not one single piece of that kind of physical evidence has ever been discovered. Not one.
And that leads us to one last, really mind-bending possibility. What if it's not an either-or situation? What if it's both? What if what we're looking at is a religious story, a myth about creation and the gods, but it's a story being told using the language and the symbols of a forgotten science they once understood? In the end, it seems the stones of Dendera are still holding on to their secrets. You've seen the evidence for yourself, you've heard the technical argument, and you've heard the symbolic explanation. So the final question really comes down to you. After seeing both sides, which one do you find more convincing? What do you think is really going on here? Is it a glimpse of ancient electricity or a deeply sacred symbol? Let me know what you think in the comments.